Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our panel session this afternoon on promoting a level playing field for steel decarbonization. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala to provide some opening remarks. Dr. Ngozi, as you all know, is a strong advocate of hearing business voices at the WTO and of using trade to accelerate climate action in energy intensive sectors like steel. DG, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jean-Marie, for that introduction. And I really do want to thank our panelists for taking the trouble to come and do this. They're all very busy and important people. So it's much appreciated. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this panel is about promoting a level playing field for steel decarbonization, which is a really important topic for us, one in which my deputy Jean-Marie Pargan has been taking a leading role in trying to work with the private sector in looking at these issues. Trade and trade policies are indispensable to underpin the technological and economic shift towards the low-carbon future. Our World Trade Report of last year showed how open and predictable trade helps diffuse low-carbon technologies, cutting the cost of decarbonization and achieving mitigation and adaptation goals. Decarbonizing hard-to-abate heavy industries such as iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and transportation is crucial to achieve our net zero targets in the coming decades. And earlier on this afternoon, we had a section on the transportation and logistics sector. The iron and steel sector alone accounts for around 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. 70% of global production of primary steel relies on carbon-intensive blast oxygen furnaces. We already have different pathways to decarbonize steel production, and now it is critical to accelerate the diffusion and deployment of low-carbon steel-making technologies. This, however, will require greater cooperative efforts, fast action, and massive investment. To get there, and considering that steel is a highly export-oriented sector, the steel industry needs the right trade policy environment that will support its decarbonization efforts. It should enable investments in breakthrough steelmaking technologies, ensure availability of critical inputs, and increase the demand and cost competitiveness of green steel. Steel producers need a level playing field so that they can continue to decarbonize and trade internationally under fair and aligned conditions. The right policy environment ensures that we move towards a low-carbon future together and do not leave behind those countries with less resources or which are less advanced in decarbonizing their economies overall. Today, however, we see an increasing number of fragmented and uncoordinated actions, and we hear growing concerns about the implications to a level playing field. Let me give you a few examples. Countries around the world are placing a price on carbon for steelmaking, an important stick to accelerate the low-carbon transition. But the World Bank counts 73 different carbon pricing schemes in force globally, with different countries using carbon taxes, prices, and regulatory frameworks. At the same time, major steel-producing countries are offering various carrots in the form of tax incentives or funding opportunities to incentivize and accelerate steel decarbonization efforts and the adoption of low-emissions technologies like green hydrogen. These different baskets of carrots and sticks are an important part of the low-carbon transition, but they can alter the competitive balance and shift green investment towards countries with more supportive policy environments. Trade restrictions are also affecting access to key inputs needed to decarbonize steelmaking. For instance, OECD data shows that more than 40 countries have restricted the export of ferrous scrap, a scarce and critical input used in lower emission steel production. We have also learned from our ongoing engagement with the steel sector that there are more than 20 different decarbonization standards and initiatives that provide the basis for calculating greenhouse gas emissions embedded in products. Incompatibilities in how we count emissions ultimately contributes to a slower pace of change. As you can see, fragmented and uncoordinated trade policies can make it harder for the steel sector to decarbonize, as they create uncertainties for producers, hamper the cross-border movement of green technologies and inputs, and put the brakes on investments in cleaner technology. This is the exact opposite of what we're aiming for. There may be good reasons for such different approaches to drive steel decarbonization. While it is encouraging to see multiple countries and stakeholders take action, we must ensure that we leverage the trade tools at our disposal in a way that is transparent and non-discriminatory, consistent with WTO rules. If we do nothing about these risks related to fragmentation and a global level playing field, we might soon see an increasing number of trade frictions and disputes coming to the WTO. This is why the WTO needs to be part of the solution in addressing uncoordinated trade policies for steel decarbonization. The WTO can play a role as a forum for international cooperation among private and public stakeholders on aligning and coordinating trade policies, as well as promoting a level playing field. For this, we can leverage the WTO's transparency tools, convening power, and global membership. International cooperation at the WTO can help the steel industry to efficiently decarbonize and trade internationally. We have made great strides in bringing this issue to the forefront through continued engagement with our members and the steel industry, our partnerships with other relevant organizations, and our own analytical work on decarbonization standards. We have received strong encouragement for this work from the industry and our members who regularly discuss the proliferation and fragmentation of decarbonization policies in the Committee on Trade and Environment, the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, and other WTO bodies. To date, our work has focused especially on standards. As the Trade Forum for Decarbonization Standards held earlier this year in March, we heard from industry and other stakeholders that the WTO has an important role to play to support steel decarbonization. Continuing multi-stakeholder dialogue such as this and providing an open platform to give space to industry to exchange ideas transparently and openly is one way the WTO can use its convening power and broad reach to promote sector-wide decarbonization. Taking advantage of the existing guidance and frameworks of the WTO, for example, the TBT agreement, when it comes to setting standards, can decrease trade frictions and promote inclusivity. In the lead up to COP28, we will need to strengthen these partnerships and explore how trade can be part of the net zero transition of the iron and steel industry. Already, our ongoing work with the United Arab Emirates and international partners has generated interest in leveraging WTO principles to align emission measurement standards, which we hope will lead to tangible outcomes at COP28. As we look ahead, we see opportunities to expand our discussions across the range of decarbonization issues facing heavy industries like steel. Today's event is a step in that direction, and I'm excited about what more the WTO can contribute to overcoming this massive challenge. I look forward to a productive discussion and a thought-provoking one today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DG, for your substantial remarks, which set the stage for our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been joined by an excellent group of speakers today representing leading steel makers and also the United Arab Emirates, a host of COP28. In my turn, I would like, after the DG, to thank you. It is so important to be able to engage with private sector because for us it's a reality check. I have been personally recently in China and in the US where I could have this discussion with steel makers and visit some facilities. I must say that I was impressed and saw firsthand the massive efforts and commitment that they are deploying to decarbonize this very polluting but at the same time essential industry. So thank you again. It's very important to have these leading product producers, including from countries like India, with us today. This reality check makes us think here in the WTO that we have a lot to catch up to support those efforts toward decarbonization. Let me just introduce our speakers. We have the pleasure of being joined today by Mrs. Erika Chan from US Steel, Head of Sustainability, Mr. Qiao Guangdong, Chief Representative for Carbon Neutrality, China Baowu Steel Group, Mr. Ola Hansen, Public Affairs Director, H2 Green Steel, Dr. Yassar Jarrah, Advisor to His Excellency Dr. Tani Al-Zayudi, Minister of State for Foreign Trade from the UAE, and last but not least, Mr. Rajiv Mangal, Vice President, Safety, Health and Sustainability, Tata Steel. Dr. Jarrar, if you would allow me, given your role for COP, I would start with you with the first question. As mentioned by our DG, the proliferation of uncoordinated initiatives and policies to tackle steel decarbonization pose a risk of fragmentation, which can increase cost and uncertainty and slow down the net zero transition. So the question is, how can we use the COP28 opportunity to promote steel decarbonization? What are the main opportunities and challenges, in your view, that we will face then? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I will share the specific agenda at COP that aims to tackle the big challenge. But let me take a step back and just introduce the general theme of COP28 for this year. And I would love to say welcome you all to the United Arab Emirates to join the conversation. So first of all, we're starting from a point where this COP is not like the previous COPs in the sense that this is a stock-taking one. In Kyoto in '97, there was the Global Awakening, climate agenda, there's a challenge. In Paris 2015, we kind of came together as the world and decided on collective action. And now we're taking stock in this COP. And there will be no surprises. This is not a spoiler alert. The report on stock taking when you come to the COP28 is we are far behind on what we said we will do. We're lagging behind as humanity, as a planet, collectively behind all the targets we set ourselves to do to save our climate. So there's a sense of urgency in this COP. And also a sense of we have to do things differently. Clearly the system as it is now in all industries isn't working as it should be because we're missing all our targets. So the spirit in this COP is let's unite, be very inclusive, and I will come back to this word inclusive many times in terms of being able to pull all the parties in, but also to start disrupting the current status, looking for solutions, different ways, and having a very honest conversation on the whole spectrum of climate agenda. So when it comes to steel, here's what the COP will offer for the producers, because ultimately it's for the producers and the consumers to tackle this. There's a lot going on in this industry, so there's no lack of ideas, there's no lack of technologies, no lack of standards. In fact, there might be too many. And that's probably what the DG was alluding to when she gave us numbers of 73 and 20 and so on. So I will not repeat those numbers, but the word is coherence. So how can we bring some coherence toward this in a fair and just way? So it's not good enough only for bigger players, or it's not good enough for the LDCs. It has to be good for everyone. And to look at this, it's a complex system. This is an industry, before we start talking about decarbonization, this is an industry that was mired with trade disputes. This is not a simple industry that was straightforward in terms of this trading systems. And now we're adding this complete new layer of decarbonizing, which requires data, requires standards, requires trust in the ability to be able to measure, requires technologies for abatement, innovation, adoption. So the COP this year will look at this, and I will say some more about this, but we'll look at this from 3 different lenses. The lens of supply, demand, and the standards. And we think there's room for work in all 3 of them, by governments and the private sector and the international organizations. This is where everybody has to come together. On the demand side, on the supply side, I think we have suppliers here that will say much more than I can say about that. But on the supply side, there's technologies, but the issue is, are these technologies accessible to everybody? Does everybody know where and how to access them? And is the investment right in them? What are the right technologies, and what should we expect from them? Whether it's electric furnaces, whether we're talking about CCS, whether any kind of technologies that are being used now to decarbonize. So there's a lot of work to be done on the supply side, and not just the big suppliers. This is an inclusive discussion, so we have to look at how can we look at steel industry across the board. But there's also a lot on the demand side, because if we want the suppliers to invest in this industry, in decarbonization, then there's an investment that has to be forked out, and this has to have a market. So we're looking at creating and consolidating and bringing up this market. And this market can be created by government regulations, who can create markets, put incentives, but it has to be a global market. If we make it a fragmented local market, then we end up with all the disputes that we have. So there's a conversation about how do we manage the demand side, and how do we put the regulations towards that, and that's where we're working with the World Trade Organization. But probably the area that's going to get the most attention is the standards, because at the moment we can all have these markets, we have the trade rules, but if we don't agree on a set of standards on how to measure abatement, how to measure carbon, how to measure how to certify whether something has been done or not, the percentages, there's no common language. So even if we have rules to play with, there will be no common language by which we can trade and agree on what has been done. So there's going to be a lot of focus on standards. There's no lack of standards and regulations. In fact, what we need is coherence. So I keep coming back to this idea that the WTO has put on the topic of this session, which is coherence. Can we agree on a common set of standards that we can all play with, accept how to measure certain things? And if we don't have that basis, then I'm afraid working on the supply side, the demand side, the technology side will keep growing this fragmentation to a point where it might snowball and just lead to more disputes. So I think the trade issue has to be looked at from these lenses, and that's what the COP is going to try to offer this year as a platform for conversation with the producers at the forefront of that. And I'm happy to say more about the mechanisms of that later on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jarar. Thank you for this realistic assessment and speaking on standards. I'd like to turn to Mr. Rajiv Mangal. Mr. Mangal, Tata Steel is known for the importance that it grants to well-designed public policy to support decarbonization. But one very interesting element, we just talked about standard, interesting element is that it seems that Tata has developed an internal carbon pricing system. So we'd be happy to know what are your views on carbon pricing, internal, but in general also, and including the corollary to carbon pricing, which is, for instance, mechanism as CBAM in the European Union, which aim at leveling the cost of carbon.
Thank you.
You have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity to be present here. Carbon pricing has a very important role to play to make sure that net zero is achieved at the lowest possible cost. In the past, the inability of the world to factor the full cost of social, economic, and environment has resulted in development of a lot of emissions and hence the challenge of climate actions that we are looking at. The carbon pricing process ensures that abatement happens at the right place in the lowest cost. Another way to look at it is on the carbon tax, which is a standard mechanism, but it does not connect on the market side, and it also does not facilitate finding the most efficient answer as far as the carbon mechanism goes. Steel industry, as we heard, accounts for almost 8% of the global emissions. One of the impediments on this decarbonization journey is the significant cost difference that exists between a green steel and a steel as normal. As we also heard, 70% of the steel worldwide is today made from blast furnace and the basic open hardness route. So if one were to use some alternate technologies which are known, one were to use, let's say, natural gas and DRI, the incremental cost is almost 40% higher than the standard. If we even go further, cleaner towards green hydrogen, the cost differential becomes almost 70% higher. At the same time, if we were to emit but capture it in the form of CCU, again the cost difference is almost 40% higher. Now, till we find an answer to absorb these costs, it will be unrealistic to expect a steep transition for the industry on the decarbonization side. And that is where the role of carbon pricing can help to bridge this gap between clean steel and steel as usual just now. But absolutely important is to make sure that this cost is passed on to the customers. If not, it has a risk of carbon leakage, which means geographies which are producing steel at higher emissions, the supply can go from there, from the geographies which are lower carbon emitting steel. So overall, around the world, emissions does not go down, and the industry which is more efficient gets penalized. So carbon pricing is important to make sure that carbon leakage does not happen, and that's where, to me, the important subject of CBAM comes into picture, where EU is moving towards. Systematically, as Europe will move towards its Fit for 55 2030 plan, it's going to reduce its free allowances, and it's getting replaced with CBAM. Now, so far the European steel producers have been bearing a significant part of this carbon cost, which is actually not getting passed on to the customers, and that is putting the steel industry in Europe at a grave risk. CBAM, in our opinion, provides a level playing field in European Union with respect to carbon cost, because with that, all steel sold in Europe will have to pay based on the inherent carbon which is embedded in that particular steel, which ultimately will get passed on to the market, to the customers. It also allows the importers of steel into Europe, to take credit, because if there is a well-mature carbon market in their domestic area, they can get a credit of that. And on top of it, there's an incentive to produce green steel for export into Europe. Now, if it does not happen, then we are going to shift the steel production from Europe into other zones, and it makes the industry in Europe absolutely unviable. Tata Steel operates a very well-functional plant in Netherlands, and we are committed to move out of blast furnace route into green steels, into cleaner steel, and hopefully towards green hydrogen in due course of time. So I'll conclude my remarks coming to on the global carbon markets. If we have to achieve a global transition towards net zero, it's not only sectors but also the locations where the cost of decarbonization is low need to be supported. And hence, there's an opportunity for working in the low developed economies, historically, who have also been emitting lower emissions, especially when we calculate it on per capita basis. Thus, both mitigation and development can be addressed if high cost but economically developed areas support low cost but not so developed economies in this emission journey, so that overall globally we are able to address this challenge of net zero towards it. And that's where, in our opinion, a cohesive global carbon market becomes extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mangal. I'm turning now to Mr. Chia Guodong. Mr. Guodong, you represent the largest steel producer in the top steel producing country. So in your turn, I'd like to hear from you what are the challenges from the fragmentation of global markets and the priorities and the areas where greater cooperation might help in your views. You have the floor.
好，谢谢主持人。这个钢铁这个产品的脱碳，对钢铁这个制造流程来说是一场革命。我在这个过程中要对一些这个标准啊，这个特别是技术问题啊进行解决，同时呢还要设计一个发展阶段的问题。同时呢，就这个低碳钢的标准也是我们绕过去的一个问题。从目前来看呢，这个国际上对这个低碳钢的标准啊，呈现了一定的碎片化的这个趋势啊。一方面，这个低碳钢这个不同的标准，它涉及的这个覆盖边界、计算方法，还有这个参数取值啊，应该是各有不同的。这也给我们钢铁企业带来了一些困扰。另外呢，就是 我们钢铁的下游用户对这些标准的认可度也存在不同，这也带来了我们这个标准曲线方面的一些差异。钢铁生产企业为了满足这个客户的差异化的这个需求在这个需要采用不同的这个标准，对产品进行一个计算和一个认证。实际上，这样对我们这个钢铁企业这个连续性的生产工艺和生产组织带来了这个负担。我们要对这个用不同的标准，对我们的同一工厂生产的产品它的实际数据进行了试算，这个发现呢，不同标准得出来结果尽管在这个存在着共性和有相关性，但是在确认是否是低碳钢方面，应该说不同的这个标准得出的这个数据结果是不同的。所以说，这个我们现在有一个需求就是应该比较迫切，就是对不同的标准，是吧？应该有一个相互确认、采信的这样机制，是吧？在充分这个考虑不同的国家和不同地区在这个资源的这个条件、禀赋和这个发展阶段的差距，是吧？建立这个共同而有区别、可持续的这个标准体系我们认为还是有必要的。这个低碳钢的标准，应该是我们钢铁企业和这个我们下游这个企业产业链共同的一个需求，是吧？需要我们这个产业链的这个厂家和用户共同去一起去。在这个过程中这个需要我们这个金融资产，还有我们的这个政策协同发力。当然，在这个不同标准的互认方面，也需要政府间的合作。同时，也希望我们通过这个 WTO 今天这样的平台，是吧？今后能够在我们这些标准互认方面，能够取得更好的沟通和交流。谢谢。
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Chair. I'm turning now to Madame Erika Chen. The US still has set a goal to achieve net zero greenhouse by 2050. So I'd like to raise the same question that with other panelists. How does trade policy uncertainty and fragmentation do affect your efforts to reach this target, and what are the opportunities that you see for further international cooperation? But I'd like to add another dimension to the question, which is what you can tell us about the context and, of the discussion between the US and the EU on the green steel global arrangement on sustainable steel. Madam Chen.
Well, thank you very much for having US Steel on this panel and in this discussion. So, the path to net zero emissions is going to require several years, and it's complex and will also require significant investment, not only on new projects and equipment, but also in our workforce. So, for example, as part of this transition, we intend to make investments in our production processes, so both our EAF and blast furnace routes. And critical changes to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, including the incorporation of direct reduced iron in carbon capture, as well as hydrogen as part of our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. These all require significant investments in our plants and our employees. And it's important to note that these go well beyond the 2030 timeline. I think there are expectations of, given the global crisis, that we need to move quicker, but it requires significant capital and significant time. And so with the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. government is actually providing financial support to emissions-free energy production, as well as decarbonization. And these programs are still in development, so time will tell the benefits of that on the steel industry. And as a result, U.S. Steel and other domestic steel producers are taking on the costs of these in form of private capital to fund this transition to net zero emissions. And we need to be able to operate profitably for a sustained period of time, and we need to have access to that capital. So trade policy in other markets, particularly those that have received significant subsidization and other forms of government support, that maintain or even increase global capacity, overcapacity for steel production, poses a significant threat to us achieving our net zero emissions goal. And the failure of governments to reach a comprehensive global enforceable solution really to help eliminate this global overcapacity is a major challenge. And so with specifically the US-EU global arrangement negotiations, these are one path for us to potentially address this challenge of overcapacity. But as you know, these negotiations are ongoing, so time will tell how this will significantly impact and benefit the steel industry.
Thank you, Madam Chan. I follow up with Mr. Hansen. We have all the elements: fragmentation, overcapacity risk, cost, and indeed the private sector is playing the leading role into decarbonization. So, with all these challenges, and how can you do more? How can you leaders do more net zero commitment and promote this decarbonization?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Looking at us, really, it's, I would say, two major things. I can dig a little bit deeper into them, but it's first, it's putting a price on the emissions, a cost for emitting greenhouse gases, and then also creating demand in different ways. When it comes to the cost of emissions, we are now in our first plant we're building in northern Sweden. We are using renewable hydrogen-based direct reduction technology to reduce the emissions with 95% compared to the sort of traditional or existing primary steel production in Europe. So it's really a deep decarbonization, near zero steel products we're sort of producing. And with the current system in EU, there is an emission trading scheme. There is a price on emissions, but as we heard here from excellent presentation of Mr. Mangal on the ETS, that currently the industry is getting all the emissions allowances for free. The real cost for emissions is not introduced yet due to the risk of carbon leakage. But now with Fit for 55 package in EU and the planned introduction of CBAM, there is actually a plan to introduce gradually a full cost for the emissions in the steel sector, which for us, which have only 5% of the emissions of our competitors, but as we heard also Mr. Mangal presented here, a higher cost for production, this is absolutely crucial. So in EU, and CBAM is really the mechanism that makes this possible. I understand there can be hurdles in the initial phase with reporting, but after that, it's really creates a level playing field for the European market with where any global player can participate. And I think to a comment here on Dr. Yarar's ambition to create one global market, I think if you wait for that, you risk of waiting too long and prolonging the decarbonization. So I think as long as if it's a regional market, as long as it's accessible for all global players, I think that's fine, and that's a good start. So we should not wait for a global market. We should aim for it, but we should not wait for it. So that's, I think we agree, but maybe not. So I think that's an important aspect, and really also highlighted by Mr. Mangal here, that CBAM really creates also a market for green materials in EU. If you're outside EU and you plan to produce decarbonized materials, you finally have a market where you can sell these products with a premium. So it's also an opportunity even though you need to, of course, carry out the required reporting. But also, if you look in Europe, reporting is the first step of getting sort of a view on where your emissions are, where in your value chain are the emissions, and it's the first step to really action to mitigation. So I think, and also nice to hear Director General Ngozi talk about the level playing field on the global side. We have used the same phrase, a level playing field, within EU. Really, for us, as a near zero producer, there has not been a level playing field compared to the existing blast furnace producers. But with CBAM and the phase out of reallocation, we will get to a level playing field also in EU for decarbonized products, but it will take some time. So second aspect is demand. I think for us, demand has come from actually voluntary commitments from our customers. Leading automotive companies, white goods, and construction companies in EU and other parts of the world have set science-based targets, which sort of forces them to look on the whole value chain and set also not targets based on what they did last year or what their competitors are doing, really targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement goals. And when they have sort of sorted out their emissions in their production or down sort of use phase when it comes to automotive, what is the next big thing? They look on what materials they source, and then steel is really important. And if they don't get the decarbonized steel, they will not be able to meet their targets. That's why we have been able to sell almost 50% of our first 5 to 7 years production with a green premium to these companies, and that's our whole business case. Of course, and this, as we see, we assess this demand, it's much bigger than we can meet. But this does not help, of course, all global players. And then I think that's where policymakers can make a difference. In addition to carbon pricing, you can create pull mechanisms to create a mandatory demand. You could put it long-term in the future, but it creates also investor certainty that there will be a market for decarbonized materials in the future. It makes an investment case. Then, for example, you can have a quota system where a blend-in steel is required 1% first year, increasing slowly. It doesn't add a lot cost in the end product, but it creates certainty that there will be a demand going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hansen and all panelists. I'm going to try to lead you into a second round of questions. We have approximately 15 minutes because I absolutely want to keep time for questions from the floor. So I would kindly ask you to go to the point with 2 to 3 minutes answers. Maybe coming back to you, Dr. Yarar, you alluded to the developing countries' perspective in your initial remarks. How can developing countries be engaged in and take advantage of the opportunities of decarbonization of heavy industries like steel? I'd like you to come back to that point.
I'll try to be as brief as possible on a topic that is really complicated. Look, we're dealing with a complex system, and complex systems, by definition, they have no straight line solutions. And there's every time we look at a certain angle or a certain way of convening, like you mentioned, in terms of blocks, the EU coming together as a market where demand is harmonized and generated. This might advantage some people, it might disadvantage other people. So I think what COP plans to do is to look at this complex system. And there's many answers floating around. There's mutual recognition ideas. There's issues of data. You know, we're in the age of data. We talk about in data we trust, but yet we don't trust the data. We don't trust our own data, let alone everybody else's data. So what we have is on the 5th of December, there's a day dedicated to industry and energy. And that day is about having a very honest conversation between all the parties, because we have to keep growing and we have to keep development, and progress has to continue, and hence we need to produce more steel and people will consume steel. So this is not about slowing production or slowing development or progress. The world is moving on. This is about how fast can we decarbonize in this development that we're seeing around the world, and what is the best modality that everybody can come together on. And this is the coherence. And we heard from Erica about the whole idea of this is going to take 30 years. It's going to take probably more. We need to invest. Even with government support. Now, the world doesn't have that much time. So is there other ways? So this whole idea of the Day of Industry and Energy is trying to look at this, and specifically at developing nations and how to make sure this is inclusive. If you just allow me one more minute on thinking about the micro aspect of this in developing nations. Macro, we can agree on big standards, we can talk about big blocks, advanced economies. But if you go to the micro, and you look at steel producers in developing nations, and you look at the issues, and we held a couple of industry sessions to understand these issues. There's the issue of technology. You'll be surprised that what we think is common knowledge is not common knowledge. So not everybody is very clear on all the technologies that are out there, how to deploy them, how much they cost. Sometimes we have these echo chambers when we talk to sort of advanced players, and we think that it's obvious, and it's not obvious. So there's about knowledge, access, locations. Can we get to the right locations? Not every location is suitable for all the technologies. There's an issue about finance. And can we get the right finance to these when we talk about developing nations? Most of these developing nations have the highest risk quotas when it comes to financing, from development finance or just normal commercial finance. So how can we make sure, because this requires an investment. And there's the issue of regulations, and governments are still don't have the capacity in the majority of the world to do the right policies, to put the right policies in place. So these three things at the micro level will be discussed on the 5th of December.
Thank you, Dr. Jara. Ola Hansen, I'm just following up on the same question. I mean, we learned that H2 Green Steel has recently secured a financing of $1.5 billion US dollar to build a large scale. So this is heavy investment. And how can trade and trade policy help disseminate those technologies and facilitate access to the wider users?
As I mentioned earlier, it's a lot about sort of investor certainty, and of course we have been scrutinized a lot, being sort of the world's first sort of large-scale, commercial-sized sort of renewable hydrogen-based production unit. So it's not been easy. And this is a very tricky question, I would say, how to scale this. But I think, in addition, as I now talked about carbon pricing and demand in my last remark, I think what is the basis for us to make this investment in addition to those? It's really the infrastructure that we need for our investment. And I think there, and for us, it's really the availability of both power and renewable electricity. And I think that is something that can be found in many developing countries. But of course, we also heard from Dr. Yarar here that investor certainty, investor climate is also an important aspect, and that I think long-term how to improve that will be a very important part. And then I just discussed here earlier on how you could sort of end up in a catch-22 situation, like you need, as a developing country, to invest in infrastructure, get hold of the technologies to get the investment, and the investment won't come before you do that. So in a way, how do you create a way around that situation? And it's not an easy task. But I think, as we mentioned, standards, especially for hydrogen, I mean technical standards, not only what is sort of considered renewable hydrogen, but also technical standards will improve trade. Also trade in all types of renewable electricity generation, transmission, and infrastructure in general will improve this. And I think WTO can play a really important role here going forward. But it's a very difficult question. I don't have an answer. I wish I had, but I think there are many areas that could improve the situation.
We are there to find collective answers. So
Yeah.
I'm turning to Dr. Mangal. We heard infrastructure, certainty. There is a role also for financial disclosure that I'd like to ask you about. How can globally consistent and aligned inclusion of climate information in financial disclosure can help drive the low carbon transition for the steel sector?
Thank you. The transition we are talking for steel sector involves very big numbers. Estimates range between $5 to $6 trillion over a period of next 30 years. That amounts to almost $150 billion on a per year basis. Normally, steel assets typically run for 30 to 40 years, and hence climate change has also brought in huge physical as well as climate change related risk for the steel industry. And hence, the regulators, the stakeholders, the analysts are now looking at more comprehensive, comparable, and a consistent reporting of the performance on ESG parameters by different companies around the world. Tata Steel as a company, we started long time back on reporting as far as the GRI initiatives go. We have started reporting on the recently announced SEBI guideline of business sustainability and reporting. You mentioned about internal carbon pricing. We have a $40 per ton of internal carbon pricing that we implement for all our CapEx and OpEx decisions, just to align the thinking of the entire organization towards the challenge that faces us. And we have also announced a net zero by 2045, both for the company. Now, the challenge is India has come up with a set of regulations, Europe has come up with a set of regulations, but globally, unless these regulations converge, we will have a challenge in right flow of finance to the right markets. And that's where we believe there's a role of ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board. They have recently come out with certain standards. So if everybody converges and aligns to ISSB standards, it can play the same role as what for financial reporting, international financial reporting standards has been playing. It will also ease the multinationals to harmonize reporting, because that's also a challenge many multinational companies are facing. Last but not the least, it also facilitates common research, use of data, which will help to improve the overall standard. So there is a role for convergence of the ESG reporting, which will help both the regulators, stakeholders, as well as the organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mangal. Madam Chan, I'm coming back to you because you represent a very interesting experience in the US. You have a country which is dominated by electric furnace production to some extent, but as a major US steel producer that employs blast furnace production method, what are the opportunities and challenges that you see in the transition toward low carbon, and what are the government policies, national, international, that could be helping?
As part of U.S. Steel's Best for Both and Best for All strategy, we have significant steel production via both blast furnace and EAF routes, as you mentioned. And they're needed today to make all the high-quality steels that our customers demand. So along with the incorporation of EAFs, we have process optimization, DRI, carbon capture, and other technological developments that we all require significant capital investment. So they're all potential components of us meeting our pathway to our net zero goal. And these potential projects, not only require significant capital, as I mentioned, but require significant time. And adoption of technologies like carbon capture and sequestration and our blast furnaces are actually still in technological development. So there's maturity that's needed with a lot of these technologies that will help us decarbonize. And this further emphasizes the need for U.S. Steel to operate at sufficiently profitable levels, to fund these capital projects, and to also provide the support and training to our workforce as we transition to meet our net zero goal by 2050. And so policymakers want to ensure that our company, as well as other domestic steel producers, are able to achieve net zero goals. We really need to have the financial wherewithal to make these investments. And we've heard a lot of talk about standards and fragmentation, and I couldn't be more in agreement that we need to really have a comprehensive global approach to standards that incorporates a dual approach that recognizes that we still have a considerable amount of blast furnace production as well as new EAF production. So, with that, U.S. Steel actually joined Responsible Steel. It provides a comprehensive standard that is inclusive, that is very much looking at a sliding scale approach, and we believe that, it will help move the entire steel industry along.
Thank you very much, Madam Chan. Mr. Chiao Guodong, I'm turning to you for the last of this second round of questions with the same question, basically. What more can be done to ensure access for developing countries producers to renewable technologies and input to decarbonize the steel industry from a trade perspective? You have the floor.
好，就像刚才主持人所讲到的，这个钢铁行业的碳中和转型应该需要大量的技术和这个投资来进行支持。这个发展中国家从它的发展阶段、资源的条件和一些技术的储备来看呢，它做这个碳中和这个转型啊，和我们发达成员国相比呢，应该还是有一定的困难和一定的差距。这也需要我们这个发达成员能够在这个技术分享方面能够进一步进行这个加大。当然，我们说是那个发展中的国家是吧？这个钢铁行业也希望能够在这个包括可再生资源技术和这个低碳冶金技术层面，能够获得更多的这种资金支持和技术支持。作为这个最大的钢铁企业，宝武也在这个低碳冶金的这个技术方面不断的进行这个探索和实践。这从目前世界钢铁的行业来看，长流程、高炉流程啊，仍然是个主要装置。所以我们围绕这个高炉工艺啊，也在探索这个负氢碳循环氧气高炉这个工艺，也就是我们所说的 HACRF， 啊，目前正在这个试验阶段。同时呢，我们也在加快这个建设新技术炉，啊，配套电炉和这个连铸这个直闸工艺，是吧？希望能够生产近零碳的这种绿色钢铁产品。当然，我们在这过程中也愿意与我们同行的这个钢厂啊，这个开展这个技术这个一些交流和探讨。我们也希望在这个 WTO 的这种协调推进下，是吧？我们各相关方吧，坚持这个多边原则，是吧？在这个提升我们资源的禀赋条件。提升我们的产业效率和能源效率，是吧？推动我们的低碳钢铁的技术发展方面，做出更多的努力，共同推动这个碳中和社会。好，谢谢。
Thank you very much, Mr. Guodong Chia. I'd like now to open the floor for question. Please raise your hand or your flag if you have one. Identify yourself, and if you can tell us to which panelist the question is directed, it will be helpful. The floor is open.
Hi, I'm Alan Beattie. I write for the Financial Times. I'm not quite sure who should answer this, actually. Anyone who likes or wants to can take it. Even if you adopt similar standards across different companies and indeed different countries, the fact remains that the EU and the US have very contrasting approaches to what should be done with equalizing carbon prices. The EU as you know, on a pricing system based on its own emissions trading system. The US just prefers shoveling out cash to try and make the steel more carbon light. And the EU has clearly signalled it does not intend to give the US a free pass on CBAM simply on that basis. So no matter what the private sector does, how do you think those two different approaches could be reconciled without creating quite a serious transatlantic trade war over steel?
Thank you, Mr. Betty. Picking up another question behind you, gentlemen.
My name is Preetham Banerjee. I'm from the Center for WTO Studies in India. As a follow-up, I think that's the first point is that even if there is agreement that individual countries have their own programs, there is no agreement on the cost of carbon, the global cost of the price of carbon. There is no agreement across countries. So that's one. Second, even in electric furnace route, you're using scrap steel. So if one has to look at the value chain of the entire emission process, then scrap, where the scrap comes from is a important issue. That could have come from a highly mitigating, a highly carbon emitting source. The third is that you have downstream industry. So you have large firms, some of whom are represented over here, but then the user industries will also have to comply with it. In a global production chain, where they source their steel and how they comply will be a hugely complicated process. Not just that, there's the issue of technology transfer. How do the smaller firms manage to get the technologies that you are mentioning are today available, but hugely expensive, as was mentioned by some of the panelists over here. So there are obviously challenges. And of course, as one of the panelists from the US mentioned, the transition period seems to be very, very short for the adjustments to be made. So these are important questions. And especially from our colleague from Tata Steel, I mean, you operate, units across the world, in India as well as in Europe. How do you then, as a global producer, reconcile the kind of activities that you do outside Europe and then that you do in India and other parts of the world in terms of meeting those production network challenges?
Okay, I'll pick up a third question from gentleman on my right before maybe reverting to the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to the panelists for this enlightening presentation. I just have a quick question for Dr. Yassar. And I think I would like you to elaborate more in this micro level that you're explaining, from the developing country perspective, and even further from the medium and small enterprise. For those who don't know, there are many medium and small enterprises that produce steel. And there have been some tools proposed by many members in the COP, or even here in the WTO, on transfer of technology, finances, even of the new mechanisms like these the foreign debt swaps for climate actions. So from your perspective, which other mechanisms or tools will have these small and medium enterprises that eventually will not have any more to do? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do not see any more hands raised at this stage. So a very substantial question, dear panelists. One on the divergence of regulatory approaches, one of different source of comparative advantages, and one of governance inclusiveness for SMEs. Any appetite for one of them? Hansen, you raised your hand.
I think I don't know if I grasped all the questions, but I think on the question here on the EU and US different approaches, I completely agree with your analysis that there is sort of a price on carbon in EU and subsidies sort of is the basic sort of route in the US. So there's different approaches there. How to solve it, I don't really know. I think more it's a political situation, and so it's a hard question. I think that the politicians themselves are struggling with sort of finding a way around it as well, or a way forward. I think for us, just as I explained, that the CBAM itself is a crucial aspect of our business case. So without it, it would be very hard to make our journey. I think when it comes also the question, gentleman over here, on pricing, I think we should aim for one price globally, but it's not the realistic development in the near future, I think. And as when we are talking about this, our aim is to get a price, carbon pricing mechanisms in as many geographies and markets as possible. And it will take time until these prices converge. And maybe also for it could be reasons why. You could say also in EU we will have one emission trading scheme for industry, shipping and aviation, and another one for households and road transport. And the price will be different. And maybe that's good in some cases. And maybe you can argue for that. The price shouldn't be the same in a developing country as in a developed country. So I think one price maybe not be the aim today, wouldn't be the best today either. There's a lot of things to say about scrap. I think it's certainly scrap is an really important part in the development and the decarbonization of the sector. But I think we also must maximize it as much as possible, the use of scrap. But we also must recognize that I think it's 1/3 today of the production of steel that is based on scrap, and scrap will not be sufficient going forward. We need also primary material, ore-based steel, the primary steel, and I think it's, as we heard from Mr. Mangal here, that it's 75% of the emissions comes from the blast furnaces, the primary production, and that's where we need action also really to keep the sector on a Paris-aligned roadmap going forward.
Thank you very much. Madam Chen?
Yes. I commented briefly on the US-EU global arrangement, and like my colleague from HT Green Steel, I don't think we have the answers to solve the delta, right, in the approaches. But I think it's very important for, as those negotiations continue, for them to recognize that it's very, very important to incorporate the emissions associated with both process routes, so that there is the room to grow and as well as advance on decarbonization for the technologies to scale and be adopted by the blast furnaces, and then as well as further developments with the EAFs and utilizing other technologies to truly get to net zero steel. So, I don't have the answer. I can't answer your question completely, but I think it's just really important to keep in mind that the negotiations are ongoing, and I think there are perspectives from both governments with private sector informed in that decision.
I wanted to move to the last question. So if you wanted to comment on the EU-US one. Okay, so the gentleman who asked about emerging markets, maybe developing countries, and the whole issue of inclusiveness. So look, this isn't a steel industry issue only. This cuts across all industries almost, in the sense that access to these technologies, when you drop below a certain size, then it becomes very prohibitively difficult for you to engage in the future of decarbonization. So one thing that would help, and I mentioned the complex system, so you never know where to start, but I completely agree with you, we have to start somewhere. And a carbon price is good. One carbon price is ideal, but a carbon price everywhere will create a market. So once that market is in existence, then these smaller countries and smaller companies can afford to do some investment. Having said that, there needs to be interventionist mechanisms to support, because of the timeline, because of the need to act fast, because of we're running out of time for our commitments to 1.5 and limiting the global warming. So there will be three discussions I'll mention to you at the COP28 that will probably advance this issue for all industries, but this one is one of the key ones in steel. One is a mechanism for technology transfer. Globally now, we don't have a very clear mechanism for technology transfer. This is not just about access to technology. Even if you have money sometimes, you can't access a technology. There's issues of security, there's issues of IP. So technology transfer mechanisms have to exist when it comes to abatement and decarbonization. And that's going to be discussed and on the table. There's another issue that's being, so the other one is trade facilitation. We see this as a core part of trade facilitation, being able to access the finance and the technology and the know-how. It's a core part of trade facilitation. So there are a lot of conversations happening on trade facilitation, and this is at the core of them, especially for developing nations, let alone LDCs. So there's two mechanisms looking at that. And one thing happening in the COP28 this year, and I'll finish my comments here, is we have, on day one with the Leaders Summit, we're starting with the Business and Philanthropy Forum. So 500 CEOs will come together to join forces with the political leaders. to again be inclusive and say let's find solutions, that we don't always keep looking for governments to meet first, discuss policies, and then we sort of react, as opposed to come together. So there's a lot of questions about the role of major steel producers around the world who work with all the suppliers, and some of them, they work with smaller producers. We had these conversations in other industries. What's the role of bigger players in terms of the technology transfer, know-how transfer? You heard Erica that if US Steel is thinking about retraining the whole staff, then if the US Steel needs all that time to do that, then you can only imagine smaller steel producers how much help they need by way of access and technology. So I think there's three mechanisms that are put in place to try to answer that. And hopefully we'll get much further ahead, specifically in an industry as important as steel, while doing this whole balancing act of we need to look at after livelihoods as well. And this is an industry that a lot of people need for jobs, but we all need for building our global infrastructure and living as well. So we can't slow progress, but we can't afford to continue as we are. So those are the three mechanisms I'll leave with.
I'll try to address my comments with respect to scrap and some specific queries related to Tata Steel. If I give some statistics, a scrap-based steel plant typically generates around 0.5 tons of CO2. A typical blast furnace generates around 2 tons. So it's 1/4 of that. And if one is able to feed a renewable energy into EF, you can come down to 0.2. So energy and scrap, if you are able to get renewable energy and scrap, it addresses a lot of challenge as far as steel industry decarbonization. But the problem is there is not enough scrap. Today scrap is available only in developed economies. Asia, India, China, a lot of these geographies have been investing in the last 20 years. So scrap will be available, let's say, after 20 years, not available, let's say, in the next till 2040, 2045. So in that time, what are we doing? As far as Tata Steel go, in Europe, the ground conditions are very different, and hence the speed of decarbonization is at a much faster pace. We have already stated it. At Netherlands, we want to come out of blast furnace in the next 10 years and move to more greener steel of production. As far as India goes, in the absence of any supporting policies or carbon pricing on the ground, we continue to take necessary trials. We have injected hydrogen in our furnace. We have announced electric arc furnace plants in India. We have tied up on renewable energy. So between 2020 and 2030, within India, we expect to reduce our emissions by at least 25%. Be ready as technologies mature and become commercially viable, and adopt them so that from 20 onward, 30 onwards, we come down. 45, we already have stated a net zero target. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mangal. We are coming out, we are running out of time, I think. Do I have 1 minute?
Oh, your microphone button.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Mangal. I think we have to bring this event to a close. I want first to thank very warmly our panelists for their time, dedication, and very, very interesting and fascinating comments that you shared, and the real discussion that you started to engage. Let me just make 3 remarks as a very quick takeaway, not very substantial, but which will help us in the future. First, thank you, because we heard loud and clear your interest in the WTO and the world community at large to promote cooperation to smoothen the carbon transition. Second, Dr. Yarar, we heard you on your priorities for the COP, and count with us. We will be there, and we will be bringing some activities and events on the steel issue with the hope to make a meaningful contribution. I hope that we meet again, all the panelists here in Abu Dhabi, so thanks. And third, thanks for helping us also identify new areas where we may have a look and do some research, investigation, and organize some dialogue. Of course, carbon pricing, which is already an area of interest for the WTO and several international organizations where there is some research being led. Also, we would be very interested from the results of the EU-US dialogues to be shared here, and other areas that I will review carefully with the people in front of me that I thank warmly for organizing the event, all the team of Eric Richtrom, Aiko Lim, Devin, who are there. So we will come back to you with more in the coming future, but starting with COP. Thank you very much. I think gone.
Thank you.